Start the video. So today's a recitation on the module for technology innovation. It's a 6-hour module that was live last spring. And I think the way we're going to do this is I'll still present a few of the concepts, but then hopefully you guys do have some questions. So what I put up here is actually the slides from the last lecture. And the first thing I did then is to thank Professor Eager for a number of things, but with respect to this class, he has pioneered a lot of different ways of doing teaching and evaluating you guys over the past 10, 15 years. So I know you're watching a lot of his lectures online, but this is probably going to evolve into a certain form of online education, and I think he did a great job getting in that direction and having you guys do things that you feel are useful for your time in education. Okay, so as far as that module on technology innovation, what I want to emphasize is it came from my engineering background, and then it's because I did science, then I did engineering, and then I did this technology innovation company called MMT. And a lot of the teaching along the way, I mentioned about the I-Corps program for you guys, and it was actually a message from the NSF that came out last week, because National Science Foundation is sponsoring more of this essentially new ways of doing technical innovation in the US through startup companies. And they've really been making a lot of progress on essentially just new methods. It's not here. There's plenty of, there you go. Look at this. Idea Machine Challenge. So you can gain a cash prize of $26,000 for sending your ideas in. And the good thing with these programs, there you go through all the steps. These programs are not intended for any business idea. For example, if you want to do a new app, or if you want to just take over Uber, things like that. The ideas are intended for when there's really technical engineering challenges, because that's what the programs typically will sponsor. They sponsor research and development in science and engineering, mostly engineering. So for your background here in the class, these types of programs essentially are designed for you. And they just started it 2-3 weeks ago, so you can just get in and essentially get to validate your ideas. And after the first class I gave, there's 2 people that came. They said, they're thinking about doing something, blah blah blah. So I think this is the deadline is October 26th, and I would bet that some of this work could be participating into this class as well. You can align your paper on the same idea, so you can get even more out of it, more feedback and more time, more experience. The other program that I mentioned, I-Corps, I-CORP, is going year-round, and it's also has some money associated with it, but it's specifically looking for evaluating your ideas commercially as opposed to technically. So technically, a lot of times, you can get more of that than you would like. People telling you this is going to be hard, this is going to not work, or it's going to be easy, but in reality it's hard. What the National Science Foundation really believes is if it's worth raising these challenges, these technical challenges, and if you are very, very focused on which one is more important to satisfy first for commercial purposes, then it's worth spending the time, it's worth investing in the idea. So in the 6-hour module, I spent a fair amount of time going into how to generate ideas. So the second lecture, that's really what it's about. I would say for technical ideas, my experience has been people that do arrive to something completely new already had experience doing that. I mean, you can think of the iPhone. Steve Jobs, before he arrived to it, he was working on, user interface with computer for years and years and years and years. And he was very passionate about that. So I tend to think that if you're going to find a career path that is in bioengineering, in pharmaceutical, or semiconductor, whatever it is that you decide I'm going to do and do this, as you gain experience is probably a time where you are likely to come up with ideas. Now, a lot of times you get fooled because the ideas that you come up with, you'll rule them out. You'll say, oh, this is not the way, there's got to be a reason why people don't do this, and then you move on. And I guess what I'll say very briefly to that is that to some extent, that's what makes a difference. So to be able to arrive to innovation, you have to be forcing yourself to have a lot of ideas but then sort them because you can't chase them all. So it's really part of that process of being open-minded at the same time, still being very, very focused on what needs to be done at any point in time. So the idea generation in my case was, after doing my PhD, I worked in engineering, and there were a lot of projects that did involve a certain form of material strength verification, and there wasn't any solution. And so over a period of 5 years, I was sort of thinking back that it'd be great if somebody took my thesis work and turned it into something practical. And well, we're finding out this is now 10 years ago. I did my thesis. Yeah, nobody else was going to pick it up unless I did, because I have that first-hand experience into the topic. So I formed a team, and we started working on it. And today we have good success. 2018 is a good year for us. We're reaching $1 million in commercial sales. So now we have to start thinking about how to scale this process of delivering to customers and keep moving faster and faster at this point, because everything is proven. So now it's more on the delivery side of things. But some of the stuff we had to go through here on the customer discovery is you come up with this idea and say, well, this would be useful for everything. It could be useful for, in our case, was material testing, so it could be useful for verifying the quality of parts after they're manufactured and all of that. But then the question is, who's going to pay for it and when? So that customer discovery process, what I describe in that session is essentially people writing checks. That's the only way you really verify that their willingness to solve their problems. So if they have problems and they're not willing to pay to get the problem to go away, then you haven't validated that. And it's a very, very critical path for us. That was 2 years ago. Customer discovery goal, market segments, interviews. This 4 hours is very engaged because I go through the process of explaining that you can think you're doing customer interviews, but if you're suggesting an answer, then you're not. So a lot of times the best way to know if somebody is interested or not is to be very, very clear that you're willing to take any response. You know, and one way that I've been doing this is essentially say, well, you know, I just presented what my idea is. We're still considering whether we want to do and try to make this commercial for your application. So in that context, can you give me some advice on, you know, what it would take in terms of not only the equipment, but internally, what would be the process for you guys to evaluate the business financial impact of this idea on your business? And then you may just get a straight answer, well, we think it's going to cost too much and we don't want to do it. You may get another answer, which is, well, if everybody else doing it was going to do it, but then you know that this is not your first adopter, that you have to find somebody else first that is more understanding of the issue and more willing to have that pain go away. The market segments is it's a great concept because if eventually you want to identify where you start commercially and then where you're going, and there may be some market that you do because it helps you with something else. Like in our case, right now we have pipelines is what we do for a market, first market, but we are going to go into defense applications even if they're not large volume because there's more sophistication involved, and that's going to allow us to then do something else with the technology. So we're not looking at defense application necessarily as a huge volume market, but essentially an ability to refine our tools for other uses. So the process of working on the technology and the customer at the same time is very involved. Because a lot of times you're looking at a very small team anyway, so most people on my team the past 3 years have been doing both. Both involved with the product and the customers. There's some differences on the team on percentage spent dealing with customers, for example. So I would say that anywhere from only 15-20% for let's say the hardware inventor manager, because he has to get these machines to work for everybody else to be doing the job. So he's not primarily, we shelter him from a lot of conversation. We still had to keep him up to date as to what the needs are in terms of volume, accuracy, and all of that. And then you have the other end of the spectrum. In my case, it's probably about 60% of my time, really just interacting with customer through conferences, committee meetings, calls, one-on-one meetings, and preparing for those and following up. And then also interacting with the team to make sure that we are going in the right direction to fulfill what we said we were going to do. There's a lot of responsibility there. It looks a lot easier than it is. And the last lecture, the one we're going to follow up a little bit more today is, because it's the last set of slides, so it makes sense to spend a little more time here, is what happens when you connected these dots, when you connected a need to a technology and a customer. You're not done. because then you have to start delivering. And personally, I thought as of a year ago, this was all that was going to really require the core team, the people that took this from the ground up as far as technology and customer. And it was part of the realization for the past year or so that we still are the leaders of this process of testing material, and therefore we're still the best people to run the company. For how long still that's going to be the case, who knows, but in my case it's been essentially 4 years since we founded the company, and I can say there's probably another 3 years of work for me left to do. So the only things that, in my mind, that happen very quickly is if you have an idea that is still similar to somebody else's idea, and there's really already a very strong existing market for it, then people can switch over from one to the other very, very, very quickly. But if what you're building is something that they're not used to, then all of a sudden, it's essentially a new market. They have existing budgets, but now they have to spend it on something new, something that they're not used in getting. In our case, it's really field verification of strength. Hasn't been available. They thought they were going to get it 10 years ago. Somebody said, I'll do it for you. It didn't work. So they actually are sort of worried that it won't work. So it's a little bit more of a challenge. It's more of a challenge to think of growth as being helping people change their mindset on how good engineering is done in their companies. And for our case right now, it really is an interesting process to think of that as being individual groups. So this one group, we know the people and we know who has influence, who makes decisions. And now it's a matter of connecting all those dots. So everybody one-on-one essentially come to realize, oh, if we do this year, the next year we're going to be able to do this, and in 2 years, we're really going to be better at what we do, preventing leaks on pipeline. And 2 years is a reasonable time frame, so they can go ahead and justify expenses and effort to start working now. But our biggest challenge is people either not wanting or not really spending enough time to think about what would be their job 2 years from now if they start working their way through gathering the new type of data that we're talking about. So that's kind of what the sales process is for us right now. So we can go a little bit more into different details. These slides, I use them in a few of the lectures about doing a lot of iterations, not assuming that everything you're going to do is going to work. We, in our case, did a lot of that. And if you spend too much time designing an experiment, getting all done, and then analyzing the data, you don't get to do as many iterations of it. So you want to speed up your time from an idea to really evaluating it and be willing to say, well, it may not just not work, but I learned something from it. And so that's what we did a lot now, is this process here about generating a lot of ideas and then building. So you guys are very familiar with this, the brainstorming type process. What I see as being the process we followed is going through this and this several times. Because you can't just be in brainstorming mode all the time. Eventually you make your mindset. In our case, it was fulfilling a first contract, going to a trade show, writing a paper, a trade paper on our work. These were all things that we needed some results, so we had to build something. And then the question was, what's reasonable to build that will give us the result, but also give us the ability to learn. So a lot of people have talked about minimum viable product. In my mind, it's not a single time frame, because you go here from getting to this point where you have something that you can show to the customer. And in our case, the first product we had wasn't really a minimum viable. It was less than that, but it was worth getting it out to everybody, still getting feedback and generating our first sales. So it's useful to think about it, but I think that it's not a one point in time. I like to think more of every point in time, and I'll show what we did from 2014 till last year. Is every year we had a very significant looking type of machine to test the pipe. So which one is the minimum viable product? Arguably, it'd be this one, because it was testing a pipe, so it was filling the function. But all the follow-up iteration were also very, very, very critical, and each of them based on that concept of, I'm going to think of a lot of ideas, then settle on 2 or 3 that I can try as part of this new prototype, implement them, and then fix. So we found we've been able to design and build in, say, 4 months, and then a lot of times it takes 2-3 months before everything is up and running and all the issues are resolved. Sometimes you need new replacement parts, things like that. So there's really, really a lot of iteration that we had to be willing to live with to get to a result. So before I really start focusing on sales, anything that we can talk about with respect to taking an idea, putting it along the way, getting kicked out of conference rooms, or getting people to say, well, this is really interesting, which a lot of times means you're not going to do anything. It's a lot of material I'm trying to really summarize, but I'm curious to what your impression is.
What exactly were you measuring in the pipes? Strain measurements?
Yeah, the question was what our technology does, which most, yes, so we measure yield strength, work hardening, ultimate strength, and then we have another technology to measure toughness that's going to be coming up. And they're all non-invasive. It's not that we don't touch the metal. We have a superficial deformation that we do. One removes a small chip of material, but they consider non-invasive for that application. They don't remove enough to make an anomaly on the pipeline.
Since it's a novel, like what to do it in the field, how do you then validate the understanding results?
The question was about validation. So we had to do it on sample pipes in the lab first, and then we also did it in the field where they did cutouts. So that was a pretty elaborate process. But the way we built the technology is very, very simple. We've got springs in there and load cells, stuff that's already been proven to work very well in a field environment, not subject to vibration. So we had expected that there wouldn't be much more to deal with than practical challenges of a dirty environment and having to fly equipment across the country. So those have been the 2 biggest challenge for us, as opposed to, and once everything is put on the pipe, it doesn't really matter where it is. There was a time we had issue with sunlight, But that was all kind of basic electronic work that needed to happen. And we had sometimes issues with magnets, interference, but that was also something we figured out from the lab, so we had to fix that in the lab. But yeah, those things are only when you start seeing it happening, like dust collecting between the sensors. Until you get to that point, you don't want to try to fix things that are not problems yet. So it's more useful to just go for it and then evaluate. I would say it's good not to make the same mistake twice. Try that. Good question. Okay, so I was mentioning that if you're building something that is already in an existing market, you can do this approach where you know what the customer needs because they're already buying something from other people. And then your effort is to make sure through these interviews that you're going to make something that is substantially different. And then you can go ahead and get it going. So almost have no sales, and then it picks up. It's great. If you're really doing a technology in a new market, which is really what that 6-hour module is on, not going to happen. It's longer term. So there's a whole process of getting engaged with the customer and what their problems are. And yeah, I'm really engineering by education and also like a lot of my experience, but it's been a very resonating advice through the startup community that our team, our technical team, has been and will continue to take the lead on business development. We're very vested in the success of the enterprise. We understand what the challenges are because we're just very engaged with our customers. We have about 12 of them right now. Now we want to be still getting a lot of external advice, so we don't limit ourselves to the thinking that we have from our limited experience with this one customer. So very practically, it means that we engage with the customer, we collect their feedback. If there's something we can do, we go ahead and do the work for them or modify what needs to be modified to become eligible for working with them. But we are having reviews every month or so with our advisor team that have more experience doing these processes and can point to, oh, have you asked this? Have you asked that? Are you sure you want to do this? So right now we have people that come and say, well, why don't I take over the sales for you so you don't have to worry about it? Okay, it's a very appealing idea. All of a sudden we can just focus on doing the tool. But what if it doesn't work? You know, what if they don't do what they say they're going to do? It's not good for them, but it's the worst is for us, because if we make technology, software, and it doesn't get used, all this long-term growth, all this database that's going to be associated with it, that's all gone. For them, okay, yeah, they lost a little money, the big players in the industry, so they put a bet, it didn't work, they move on. So it really is one reason for us to stay very, very engaged and making sure that the customers realize what they need. So a lot of times they think they know, but If it's something new, again, you have to go through this process of what would be the life if you were doing things completely differently. That's what we're talking about here. So doing things very differently. As far as the team or technical team is we have new people that join with us, and they're not there yet in terms of realizing how much value there is in us doing the sales. They've been used to large organization where there is. Great, everything's frozen. If you've been used to a large organization, everybody has their own things that they're responsible for. After 4 years of the opposite, maybe I think there's some advantages to just really having one job. But with respect to that technology, innovation, it all needs to come together. Like literally what we're doing even 3 months out right now is based on what we know is going to help us work with the customer and make sure that when the year ends, they'll be happy and they'll come again for more next year. So it has to be still very, very fluid on some of the decision we make. And if we have somebody else that provides, good feedback, good ideas on improvement we can make, but those improvements are not going to help us get to the next year, it's a lower priority. It's on the wish list to do, but it's not something for us to focus on right now because it's not going to change our path for growth. It's really becoming an interesting process to think about. It's the first time that happened in a while. Let's see if I can use this. So do you see the difference between new market, existing market? A lot of people would like to think that they come up with ideas that do have an existing market or they're new, but are not realizing the implication. And the hardest reality is a lot of time the actual cost is not what's driving things. It's really getting to the process of associated with a cost, a payback. That's the hardest part. And for us, it's been essentially 3 years worth of work. And we're still figuring it out. I wish it would be a lot easier, just like getting this to continue working. I think we'll end up continuing without the slides, but we'll see.
You mentioned that you were looking to scale up in the next year. Are you doing one-offs for each customer? Or are you going into manufacturing?
Okay, so the question was about how we plan to scale up right now. It's a very good question. So we have essentially three things. We have hardware, we have software, and we have service. And here we have the field service and the analytics. the data reporting. So what we are wanting to do is take this with partners, collaborators, because that involves a lot of one-on-one, week-long, seasonally changing aspects of things, whereas everything else is pretty streamlined. So if we find a good way to leverage our technology with other people that essentially are running trucks and people inspecting pipes, then we're making a lot of progress. But to speak to your question about various customers, is certain customers already have relationship with very specific vendors, and you could see it two ways. You could see it that working with their current vendor makes it easier for them, but for that vendor and for us, there's a lot more leverage if we find somebody that is interested to work for this company, this company, this company, but he isn't doing it yet. So it's a very, I'd say it's a very dynamic process right now of taking the next step. And I think you're hitting the right way. So let's say we have our customers here. And then we do rank them, by the way. we have 3 best ones. They may not care, or they may care, and it's our process right now to figuring that all out, so we don't cause a problem with our current base. But then we have our prospect. So, and I want to be very clear, when I think about prospect, 2019, I don't care too much a year later. I mean, it's great. But right now, I'm working to double or triple our volume between this year and next year. And what I believe is going to take me there is just 2 or 3 more customers. That's it. That's all we need. So the way we're going to get these is that the prospect, we have like 25 of them. And then we have to funnel that down to 10 first that are going to try us, and then hopefully up to 5 that are actually going to commit. And then out of those that commit, probably just 3 are actually not going to have other issues along the way to cause you trouble. So it's a very, very real challenge, and we've learned it this year. We had 3 people that came in, and only one of them stayed to the plan that they already had. Somebody else started and then ran out of money, literally. And then another one was kind of made up for one of them ended up doing half of what they thought they would do. It doesn't have anything to do with us. It's just a number of holes that they've exposed the pipe for testing. So we have to just live with that. So we have to bring more prospect in the process all the time. We're talking about sales for technology, and specifically what we've been working on. So after about 3-4 years, we're still trying to get a real growth taking place, getting more people, and essentially be able to transition from doing everything to having more people involved with the process and having other vendors essentially servicing our platform is, I guess, a way to think of it. And if we don't do it all, if let's say we can't get a whole lot of this done by others, at least we'll learn from it. So, but we're going to try because we know we'll learn from it. The same way this year, one thing that we've done that was very interesting is we hired 4 new people that didn't know anything about the technology, the equipment, the software, the analytics. And oh boy, they had a trouble getting trained because everything was assuming people's, intimate knowledge of what needs to be done with the machine. So they had to not just document the process, but really just simplify it. There wasn't a home position on the software to put all the hardware at the right spot to start a test. So you had to be like, okay, I gotta go -1 inch and do this and do that. And I kind of knew that this had to happen, but the people in charge are the ones who suffered from doing this training. So they're really right now doing all these improvements to make sure that when they have to train 10 or 12 people this winter, it's not going to be as hard. And the people are getting trained are not. It's double frustration from the guy doing the training and frustration from the guy that's trying to get trained because it was too hard. It was just too much complexity. Not really hard complexity, but just too many things to learn that were unnecessary. So what we're thinking specifically is to have just one. That's what we're trying. But it doesn't matter what would be a good term for that person. And then they get the benefit to be the only ones other than us doing this for a year. There's some appeal to that. But a lot of them would like a lot more. They'd like to be the only one doing it for 3, 4, 5 years, and got to get into some negotiation on that. But we focused here on kind of how to deliver. What still is the most important is to fill the funnel. So in the sequence of the lecture, I talk a lot about the 4 steps of doing a technology innovation. And that's probably a good way to wrap this up here. We have customer discovery. That's really is asking questions and hoping to get a true answer. So it's a very, very rigorous process. Then you have the validation. And for that, you do need a form of a minimum viable product because here you want to have them write a check, essentially. So if you have enough of those written up, then you start getting into, we call it customer growth. So here the process is, if you had a customer using you for 10 jobs, now you want to see, are they going to do 100 jobs, and what is it going to take for them to do that, and then respond to that very, very specifically. If they say, well, we need absolutely to have other vendors, so if you're not available, somebody else can do it. That's our condition. You have to decide if that makes sense. And then you become here, you just scale up and essentially integrate all the pieces together. So, and what we were talking here, to some extent, what MMT is working on right now is to generate that first growth with a subset of customer. We're still not thinking of all this process being scalable. We're just starting to respond very specifically to what will get us to another year, essentially. And for us, another year means only 3 good size extra customer. And the part about the sales that I mentioned probably too many times, that it kind of had to be done by us. I guess that's a starting point, but then it's not very targeted. So the term that I've been taught that we use a lot is we are proactive. So we go to the trade shows, we essentially create awareness, have discussions, and then see who are the prospects to get to the next step. You know, when I talked about here 25 that are identified, these are people that would admit that perhaps they would be useful, you know, in the future. And yeah, I want to be careful because sometimes they'll say that and they may actually be your next one. So, there's a lot that's not uncommunicated conversation in these discussions, especially in our case because it's disruptive. We are talking about bringing data reported to them on something that right now they don't have any. So they're making plain assumptions, and they're going to have to figure out a way now to go from one number for strength for a lot of pipelines to different numbers for different sections of the system and justify those decisions. So it's really going to be a big process. And that's why it's not just a dollar value, but it's a two-way commitment, and to a large extent, it's a commitment on our side to help them in that process in any way we can. It's a regulated industry, so we are involved with Department of Transportation, make sure they understand what we're doing, how it's done, and therefore they can succeed in using the data to prioritize their decisions. But that's not granted to begin with because it's all new kind of data. So that entire process, when I mentioned about 2 years, that's the reason why there's going to be a delay between having the data and being certain on what to be able to use it for, essentially.
So for these inspections, is it for initial installation or like over time to confirm that it's still functioning?
Yeah, the question is when people are willing to do the material testing, and most generally the answer is old pipelines that were built in the 60s, 50s, 60s, 70s, and they don't have any records of what was put in the ground. And there was a lot of variation in the quality of the steel that was used to make pipelines because the standard for making the steel into pipes back then was not super sophisticated, super elaborate on the amount of quality control and the type of steel to use, the type of welding to make joints, because most of it is made from flat plates that are rolled and they have a longitudinal weld. So that entire process of forming is fine, but of making that weld for good quality is not granted. So back then they were having some issues just pressure testing it. But if it did pass the pressure test, it doesn't mean 40 years later when there's cracks in it, the corrosion and things like that, dents, that it's safe. And that's the biggest challenge they have.
Would this be applicable to the gas explosion that just happened last week?
A question about the gas explosion. So from the news, it's a question of overpressurization of the line, so that one would be a different issue. But there are fireballs that happens from the weld ruptures, so that's a known issue in the industry. Probably the important aspect with respect to what happened with the old Columbia Gas asset in Massachusetts is makes people very angry whenever something goes wrong, and that's a big driver. Unfortunately, because there's so many companies operating those pipelines, not all of them are faced with the impact on the industry of an incident like this. So if you are a pipeline company that want to build new pipelines, it's terrible. But if all you have is a line that you're trying to keep running and your only goal is to keep that one line making profit every year, you're not as affected. So a lot of the big players in the industry are very vested in making constant improvement, but there is a need essentially for regulation so the standard of care is distributed among all the operators. So people like to say, well, let me do my job right, but the reality is these companies don't have the same level of incentive to step up and keep improving their programs for pipeline integrity. So that's why there's regulation, and that's why, to some extent, the public opinion and expectation do matter. Nobody wants big incident. The failure rate of a pipeline is not high because we have a lot of pipelines. We're talking about, if you include distribution, which is what was involved there, it's 2 million miles of pipelines in the US. It's a huge quantity. And the expectation for reliability is very high. So that's why we do feel there's really a need for knowing what you have in terms of pipe quality. So you can prioritize. You can't replace every old pipe, unfortunately, but our tool allows to prioritize which one is probably the best one, the best next one to replace, and have that data. Say, well, I need a budget to replace this because the data shows this is at risk type of pipe. So that's what we're doing. Thank you.